Recently, I went out on a girls' night out with some of my friends and went clubbing for the first time. They made fun of me for not wanting to drink on my first night out at a prominent downtown club, until I was confident that I understood what was happening. I wanted to make sure that I was in a calm state of mind. My buddies persisted in making me feel guilty for not being fun by applying peer pressure to get me to do it. To begin with, I wasn't sure if I would enjoy going out to clubs. Its particular set of friends persuaded me to go, but I wasn't particularly experienced with drinking, and I didn't believe I would enjoy it if that was the only way to have fun at a club. They eventually dropped it after much back and forth, and we all grabbed an Uber from the apartment where we met. As soon as the Uber dropped us off, I started to question the whole situation. The downtown area was a sensory assault with loud music playing from every bar, and even some cars, people stumbling around every corner and pushing onto every sidewalk, everyone shouting and fights breaking out, with the stench of smoke, pee, and vomit pervading the air. Overall, it was getting to the point where I wanted to drink just to avoid having to pay attention to every little detail of what was happening around me. Before we even departed, my girlfriends were already there. As we waited in line to enter, I engaged in conversation with all the men nearby. It took 20 minutes, and throughout that time I was daydreaming about my outfit, how much skin I was displaying, my companions, and my plans. I simply ignored any attempts at conversation from men, which was again criticized by my friends. I realized that I had never been very connected to these folks, and I was already beginning to regret having even made friends with them, because I had a class in common with one of them. I had just happened to start hanging out with them. These girls seemed to be the ones who could get me into it, since I had gone through some sort of end-of-college crisis, where I felt like I needed to be partying more. Sadly, it seems that I simply wasn't into it. We moved to the front of the line, and just as I realized this and felt the impulse to head home right away, I found myself entering the club. Although I had assumed such would be the case, the reverse occurred. Suddenly, I was surrounded by what felt like 1,000 people, suffocating on the odor of false fog, being assaulted by excruciating loudspeakers stuck in an echo chamber, and all of these things. They placed some inflated drink orders as we all crammed into the bar. I opened my lips to ask for water, but it seemed like the bartender sensed before I ever said it that I wasn't going to buy a genuine drink. She then blatantly disregarded me and moved on to the next customer. My companions had their drinks in their hands before I even realized it, and then they simply vanished. They had left when I turned around since I had been unsuccessful in getting the bartender's attention. I was prepared to cry. I grabbed my phone and started to call an Uber because I was feeling a little irritated and wanted to get home as well. But then a man touched me on the shoulder. "Oh, you're being ignored by the bartender. Let me get you that drink." He made the offer, barely audible over the music and inches from my face. I almost screamed back, "Oh no thanks, I'm all right." All I was receiving was water. I believe I was also about to leave at the time. "But didn't you just get here?" he inquired, poutingly frowning. For a brief while, I was at a loss for words, but I was quickly out of time. He inquired once more, "Those buddies of yours, did they desert you?" I made an effort to hide my expression from him, but he was able to read it right away. My head was filled with a wave of fear and paranoia. "Damn it," I said. "The worst-case scenario is this. I hadn't even been in this spot for 5 minutes when my buddies abandoned me, and now a strange man knows I'm alone." The only thing I had going for me in this situation, I tell myself, was that I had chosen not to drink. Thus, I was sober. Unfortunately, I was experiencing far too many different emotions to think clearly. The only option I could see at the time was to go right away without speaking to the scary man or stopping to alert my pathetic pals. I got up from the bar and headed straight towards the door. Without turning around, I realized the strange man was about to follow me as he shouted after me. Stomach sank. Had I chosen incorrectly? Maybe, but I had to keep my resolve now. As soon as I left the club, I grabbed my phone and dialed an Uber, because I knew that if I didn't get away from all those people, I was going to have a full-on episode. I set the pickup point at a random location 2 blocks away. I heard the guys screaming at me once more as soon as the Uber stated they were on their way. Even though it was just 4 minutes away, I knew the guy would find me before then. He was chasing me while sprinting. There was no legitimate reason for him to be doing it since I was certain that I hadn't left anything behind at that pub. I walked out into the roadway in front of a slow-moving automobile as he was about to approach me, forcing them to slam on the brakes and honk at me. When I turned around and saw the man trying to grab me, I instinctively came to a stop and yelled in his face, "I want to be left alone. You are someone I don't know." All of the music, all of the conversations, and all of the night sounds were drowned out by the sharp tone of my voice. Everyone on the street came to a standstill and turned to face us. "Perfect," I said. "What better moment than this to make a scene?" The man threw his hands up and stepped away as everyone turned to face him. I kept power walking in the direction I was headed when he re-entered the other sidewalk. I was relieved to discover that there were still people around when I arrived at the pickup location 2 blocks away after rounding a curve. Though the Uber was still 2 minutes away, that creep could still locate me if he wanted to. I continued to scan the area as I stood on the curb, tapping my foot nervously. A man was talking on his phone across the street and kept looking over at me. A man arrived around the bend at the opposite end of the street a minute later. He kept gazing between me and the other guy while walking while also talking on his phone. He approached me as he slowly went down the sidewalk. Finally, the Uber rounded the corner from where I had come, and I honked at it to stop. However, at the same time, I saw the creep from the vehicle's rear club using his phone while approaching me. I abruptly noticed that another automobile had rounded the opposite corner, leaving only myself, the 3 men, and the 2 cars as the only living things on this block. I became anxious. Which Uber was mine? Which one included a pass to hell? Fortunately, the car pulling up closest to me had an Uber light, looked like an Uber driver, and had all 3. I dashed in front of the car before he reached the curb and rushed inside screaming at him to lock the doors. Just as one of the men attempted the handle of the door I had just entered through, he managed to lock them. The driver accelerated without needing any additional explanation. I gave the driver a heartfelt thank you, and he drove me back to my friend's home. I should say ex-friends, because when I informed them what had happened, they made excuses for me and claimed that I had abandoned them when in fact they were the ones who had done so. People, choose your friends carefully. When I couldn't sleep one night, I went for a late-night stroll across the park. My life at the time was very active. I had recently lost my job, my mother was ill, and I had recently broken up with my 3-year girlfriend. I could not endure spending any more time inside. The scrolling indefinitely no longer served to divert my attention from my issues. At the time, a pleasant park with a pond and several ducks was only a block away from my flat. So, in the hopes of meeting some birds, I carried a bag of frozen peas that was old and half-eaten that I had discovered in my freezer, and then exited onto the street. Tuesday night, just after midnight, nothing was going on around me, and I was the only one on the street save for a car that I was traveling in. I used to be one of the ones sleeping at that time, but ever since I lost my job, I did not need sleep or any way to exhaust myself. The street was unusually quiet for me. It was unsettling yet in a good way. As usual, when I walked outside and it was noisy and busy, I didn't feel the need to listen to music. By the time I arrived in the park, which was also empty, I was already beginning to feel a little better. The lamps were fewer, farther apart, and dimmer, and it was also considerably darker. I always saw at least one homeless person sleeping on a bench in that park during the day. So I made my way to the pond gently so as not to disturb anyone who might be present. I sat down on the slope of the shore and looked for ducks in the water. They were enveloped by a mat of algae when I discovered them huddled in a little patch of cattails. The sound of me sitting down nearby caused them to gently stir while they slept, but they didn't get up to explore. I let my bag of peas rest, feeling a little down. I imagined it would be enjoyable to hear them squawking, observe their tiny bills chowing down on a handful of partially frozen peas, and then have them pester me for more when it ran out. However, I didn't want to try throwing any at them in an attempt to wake them up. That, in my opinion, would be the scariest thing of all. Instead, I sat by myself in the grass, in the silence and darkness. I was alone, or at least I believed I was, until a few minutes later when a quick approach from behind scared me out of my 1,000-yard look. He appeared out of nowhere. In an instant, they muttered an apology. "Please excuse my interruption, but may I have that bag of peas?" I could see he was homeless. I had overlooked the bench with all of his belongings next to it that was 30 feet behind me and where he was sleeping. I realized I had either disturbed him up by loudly crinkling the sack in my dismay, or he was having problems falling asleep. When I said, "You seemed genuine," I quickly handed him the bag and answered, Sure. The ducks are sleeping, but I brought it for them, so here it is." The homeless man accepted the bag with a smile and a small laugh. He responded, "You sleep, you lose," and he strode back to his bench. 100 calories in ice cold. Plain peas wasn't much, but I'm confident that any late-night snack is better than going to bed hungry. After that, he didn't bother me anymore. He quickly returned to my gaze, and I continued to listen to the bag crinkle, while the man consumed the peas, disposed of the leftovers, and then sat down once more. I fell into a kind of meditative condition after you started generating noise. I could hear the night wind's slow fronts moving through the trees. Even the resulting waves on the water's surface were visible to me. Life had some meaning, at least. Cold steel touched the back of my neck, sending a shudder through my bubble of tranquility, and a commanding voice with it. "Avoid making a U-turn. Pull out your wallet and phone, then give them to the person across from you." I complied and gave him my phone after removing it from my pocket. I hadn't brought my wallet along. The thief hissed, "Where's your wallet?" I claimed, "I didn't bring it with me. I don't have it." "Then hand over your wallet to me." The assailant drove the gun more into my neck. "Don't make me rob a dead man," he pleaded, adding that as well. I begged him to believe me, saying I'm serious. "I don't have it on me. Please, you got to trust me. Look, I'll open my pockets." But he was unconvinced. Then he remarked, "Why don't I just make things simpler for myself?" in a quiet voice. Before he could accomplish whatever it was he was about to do, I heard a familiar voice. "Hey," it exclaimed. The mugger grumbled and collapsed behind me as he turned to look in the opposite direction, but it was far too late for him to act, even if all he had to do was squeeze a trigger. A split second after the cry rang out, I heard an unnerving thud. As I struggled to stand up, I noticed the man from earlier standing over the robber, holding a sharp rock in his hand and wearing a proud yet dangerous expression. I replied, "Thank you." All of a sudden, he became really serious. "Take your belongings and leave immediately. By the time this moron wakes up, you two had better be gone." I swiftly scooped up my phone off the floor after giving a nod. The man had already hurried to the bench and was gathering his belongings when I turned around. Without more conversation, we each departed the park in different directions. He had already entered the city when I last turned around, and the mugger had just started to move. I secured the door as I hurried inside, even while none of it was likely to help me fall asleep. It was a heck of an experience nonetheless, and I'm certainly pleased to be inside right now. I simply wished I could have given the man who helped me more in return. He probably wouldn't have risked his life only to give me some peas back, in my opinion. He appeared to be the kind of person who, even if I had disregarded him, would have still assisted me. This summer, I've been hanging out at my friend Will's place a lot. I already live on the fringes of town in the area, and his dad has a few acres out in the country, about a 20-minute drive from my house. Will's father keeps a variety of animals in his private home, including chickens, pigs, and sheep, in addition to working as a veterinarian during the day and running an animal hospital on a separate portion of the property. About 300 feet from the gate to the front door, their driveway winds through the trees, barns, and livestock meadows. It doesn't look like much in the daylight, but by the time I get there, it's usually dark, making it difficult to see. I can only see with my headlights or the flashlight on my phone. Otherwise, I have to focus on the light coming from the home or wait for moonlight to see where I'm going. Aside from the surrounding agricultural activities, the house is packed with exciting things to do and is typically a great place to party. There is a pool, a gigantic TV, a grand piano, enormous Bluetooth speakers, a lot of pets, including dogs and cats, and lots of space to move around. If guests want to drink, the hosts are always happy to provide entertainment. Even better, he essentially gets to rule the home for the rest of the night when Will's dad and the person he is now sleeping with retreat to the master bedroom. The two of us who do it most frequently are Will and I, but he also invites and nudges other friends of ours to regularly spend out with us. We once welcomed Sam, a more recent buddy of ours. He was cool, though a little naive when we first met him at our local hangout. We let the dogs out in the front yard when he came so they could relieve themselves and burn off some energy from the thrill of seeing a new person. There wasn't another automobile parked in the driveway when I turned to look at it. When I asked Sam where he had parked, he replied that his mother had picked him up and that he intended to take an Uber home. Will and I were a little taken aback and worried because we always assumed that you had to drive yourself to the house. Sam accepted our apologies for not having told him because it was quite doubtful that an Uber would even show up at the house later on in the evening. However, he reassured us that everything would be all right. We also let him know that if he couldn't make it home, he could sleep in the loft. The rest of the evening went smoothly, but I ended up consuming more alcohol than normal. We were all relaxing on the back porch while listening to music after we finished playing video games and swimming. I was feeling a little lightheaded when I excused myself to take a little nap on the couch, but not so much that I thought I might pass out. I drank a glass of water and then sat down, placing my arm over my eyes. Tim entered the house from the back porch around 10 minutes later. I got up to speak with him, but he informed me that he had to go. They would be at the front gate in a few minutes, thanks to his miraculous ability to secure an Uber. The driveway was dark, and Sam wasn't familiar with it, so he asked if I could guide him to the gate. I quickly agreed to help him without giving it much thought, and then we left the house. I wasn't aware of how unprepared I was at the time, not even for a quick walk in the dark. I didn't have a shirt, a flashlight, or a phone. I was simply sporting my old, inexpensive slides and bathing trunks. Sam used his phone's flashlight to illuminate the path as he made his way to the gate. I drove him to the final bend before the gate, and as soon as we arrived there, his Uber's headlights began to shine on us. I bid him farewell before he exited through the gate, at which point I turned around to go home. I immediately became aware of how thick the darkness was. I glanced beyond the bend but saw nothing beyond the bend. When I grabbed for my phone in my pocket, I discovered it wasn't there. I debated going back to Sam to ask him for some light, but I decided against it because I didn't want to keep him waiting. I promised myself that if I simply followed the pavement, I would soon see the light coming from the house. None of that was visible at the time. There was no way to see through the dense bushes and trees. I might have enjoyed myself more if the porch light had been on, but it was only the interior lights that were on. Unfortunately, the moon, which had just set, was new. The fact that it was cloudy that evening and there wasn't much light pollution made things worse. Darker than I had ever seen, it was complete blackness. Even just thinking about it made a tiny bit of panic flare up, but I repressed it. I continued gently, attempting to take. I was taking slow, careful steps, but the darkness and my intoxication were making me fall. I stumbled off the pavement and into the ground after only 15 seconds, and I had to go back to get back on it. A little while later, I once more fell to the ground. It felt as though I was walking with my eyes closed. I waited for my eyes to adjust so that I could at least see a shape 2 feet in front of me. I tried to hear music coming from the porch, but I was unable. Even the animals were silent. All I could hear were crickets. They were quiet for the night while they slept. The last thing I wanted was the terror of complete silence, so I begged that the crickets wouldn't cease to sing. I was engrossed in my thoughts, and it took me a while to realize that I had gone off the pavement. My ability to feel the ground was hampered by the inexpensive slides I was wearing. I paused for a while, and looked for a glimmer of light in the pitch blackness. I could now distinguish between a few, but which one was my objective, and which ones were coming from the neighbors a half-mile away through dense forests? I made my way toward one in particular, since I had a feeling about it. I hit a tree after taking 5 steps. I took a step back and made an effort to look at it. At last, I could make out that there was something there, but it was only a faint blur with no depth or discernible detail. Now that I knew, I kept my hands out in front of me to avoid hitting anything else with my face. To get back to the driveway pavement, I turned 90 degrees and went on. After taking about 10 steps, I felt the worst thing imaginable contact my hands: a huge spider web. It was one of those spider webs where you run into a substantial item rather than simply a few silken threads irritating you. Suddenly, a massive web of silk began to encircle my arms, and every individual strand could contain an irate spider of unknown species. I went absolutely out of control, slapping myself all over my body and jumping around like an enraged horse to remove the spider and all of its web. After being terrified for a full minute, I felt at last protected from the spider. But now that my heart was beating rapidly, I was in a complete panic. I made an effort to collect my thoughts, breathe properly, and get my bearings. But it was clear that I was even more disoriented than before. Whether it meant waiting until dawn or until someone came outside to look for me, part of me wanted to just sit down and wait till I could see. My mind was suddenly racing with the question: would anyone come seeking for me for hours? I had no method of getting in touch with the single person who knew I had walked out there. Will and the rest of our buddies could spend hours there, imagining that I had fallen asleep in the loft and crawled inside, and they would not have bothered to check for me. I might be going the wrong way and end up on someone else's property if I tried to move toward a light. If that happened, they would believe I was trespassing and try to shoot me. Could I even pass the forest? Oh my God, am I already lost in the woods? Did I accidentally run into the tree line before I ran into them again because I was panicking? I always assumed I would have more items with me to aid me and that I would be able to see, but I never really believed I would know what to do if I got lost. It's so desolate and forested out there that I doubt anyone would even hear me if I screamed for assistance. It seemed like a good idea to remain still and watch to see if I didn't make matters worse, but I couldn't do that. That was absurd, and perhaps thinking so was simply my ego putting me in danger. I shouldn't spend the entire night outside, vulnerable to the bugs, ants, spiders, and any other carnivores that could be lurking around trying to grab a chicken. Nevertheless, I wasn't completely helpless either. I just needed to figure out where to go, because I knew I couldn't be farther than a few hundred feet from the door. Despite my fear and the fact that my judgment was clouded by alcohol, I had to reason my way out of this predicament. For a while, I closed my eyes and did nothing but breathe. I had to first take a moment to collect myself. I looked up when I first opened my eyes and noticed that there was just enough light in the sky to distinguish between the paler clouds and the trees above me. After turning my head in a circle, I eventually noticed a heart-shaped object. I studied it and realized it had to be a barn's roof, which might either lead me back to the trail or further away from it. If the latter were the case, I could just turn around. I walked carefully in the dirt toward it, while holding my hands out in front of me. The driveway was a barely lighted stripe on the ground when I finally noticed it. I exulted and stepped upon it, moving toward the points of light while continuing to fall off the sidewalk and run into a limb. However, I eventually arrived and could see the house's front. I've never experienced such a sense of comfort just from entering a building through a door. It was genuinely a terrifying few minutes, and I learned from it never to venture out into the woods unprepared. I walked out on the porch right away to share my story and make light of it.